Well, hello, and a very warm welcome to you, but specifically a very warm welcome to Liam Halligan, who you can see has joined us now. Over the next half an hour or so, Liam and I are going to kick about the issue of Brexit and anything else that might be having a big impact on the global economy and, of course, on your businesses. Liam is, I'm sure, a very, very familiar face to most of you, certainly to those of us who are joining the conference from the UK. A well-known figure on TV. He's been economics editor for Sunday Telegraph. Before that, was on Channel 4 News for a long time, reported for Financial Times, and has won numerous awards throughout those years. Liam, hello to you. Very warm welcome to you.
Nice to be with you, Daisy.
Now, of course, these times are extraordinary. You and I have both been reporting on politics and on economics for longer than either of us probably care to admit to, but these really are different times. We've obviously got the double whammy of the Brexit negotiations, which are going on or not going on. We're not quite sure as we speak, as we pre-record this interview, whilst we're all in the grips of a global pandemic, which is, of course, having huge health impacts. But specifically today, we're going to be talking about the business impacts, of course. It would be weird for me to ask you any other question right now other than, do you think there will be a deal with the European Union, or are we going to crash out? What's the future of Brexit?
Be a deal with the European Union. I think it will be at the very last minute. That's the culture of the European Union when they go into the so-called tunnel. That's the culture of politicians here in the UK as well. These are people that don't really know much about business on the ground. They're paid by the state. They're often not particularly entrepreneurial people, very strategic, always looking to see the political complexity rather than the strategic clarity. But I think you'll agree, Daisy, the bare bones of a deal are there. It will be the UK, I think, giving way on so-called state aid to a degree, the French in particular, but the Germans are worried about UK government propping up some British industries to the detriment of their EU competitors. But I think the Dutch and the Spanish, and particularly the French again, are going to have to give way on fishing. I mean, fishing's a fraction of our economy. It's less than 0.5%, but it is deeply symbolic. And also, there are an awful lot of fishing communities up in Scotland. So unless the government holds firm on fishing, then our friend Nicola Sturgeon, who runs the Scottish National Party, will make hay with that pushing for independence. I mean, a lot of foreign observers may not be aware because they're focused on COVID, of course, and financial markets and Brexit. But we really are in a situation, on top of everything you've already said, where the UK itself may break up. So there you go, the ACTA Union, all the way back in the early 1700s. We could be looking at the end of the United Kingdom. I personally find that very sad. But one of the political trends that has emerged from COVID is the Scots pushing for another independence referendum.
Just on that subject, and we won't devote much time, but you mentioned Scotland there, possibly breaking off, possibly going independent. I know you have, obviously, your name is a very Irish name. You have Irish roots. If you look at Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, can you see the same thing happening there? Could you see reunification happening?
I so often get into this conversation with my American family and Canadian family as well, and I've got family all over North America because of my Irishness. I don't think it's controversial to say, even when I speak to some of my close friends in the Conservative Party, which has traditionally been the party that's really strong on the link between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom. But even some pretty dyed-in-the-wall unionists, as they're called, linking the Northern Ireland with the United Kingdom, they would acknowledge that the sort of demographic reality is in the end that we will have a united Ireland at some stage. I'm not sure we'll see it in the next few years, but I think in the end we will see it, possibly even in our lifetimes, Daisy. In the end, it does come down to demography. The Catholic minority when we were kids is now a majority in Northern Ireland. And I think also when Ireland was partitioned in the early 1920s, the Brits wanted to keep Northern Ireland, partly to show the rest of the world they couldn't be pushed around when their empire was collapsing by a bunch of Irish farmers with broomsticks and just some fighting spirit, but also because the real crown jewels of the Irish economy were in Northern Ireland, particularly the shipyards, a lot of very sophisticated engineering up in Belfast, and there is still a lot of sophisticated engineering in Northern Ireland to this day. But the real kind of economic engine room of the island of Ireland now is the Republic of Ireland. It's an astonishing economic success story, built on export, built on education, built on tech savvy, commercial acumen. It's not often remarked among our friends in Westminster, Daisy, but for a long time now, the Republic of Ireland has had a much higher GDP per head, even than the UK. That's been the case for at least the last 10 years, even though Ireland suffered more in the financial crisis. So I think there will be a united Ireland, but I don't think anyone particularly in the mainstream of Republic of Ireland politics is pushing for that at the moment. Everyone feels that it needs more time to bed down the new arrangements, and obviously Brexit has slightly railroaded those new arrangements. But I don't think we're going to see a border poll, as we'd call it, a referendum on Irish unification in the next 5 years, maybe not even in the next 10 years.
So we do have this extraordinary situation. We've got a new situation in Scotland, a new situation possibly coming in on the island of Ireland, plus Brexit. You think there is going to be a Brexit deal. What do you think that deal is going to do to the British economy, particularly to the city, to financial services? And you mentioned fishing earlier, and this is something that I think it irritates you as much as it irritates me. When you have politicians taking financial policy decisions purely from the outside on what looks like political reasons, because fishing is a very emotional issue, as you said it there. So if you talk about services, not just financial services, 80% of GDP, as you said, fishing, less than 0.5%. What do you think the impact is going to be on financial services of the Brexit deal that you foresee?
I think that in the end, financial services will look after themselves. I mean, a huge amount's been made in the British press of something called passporting, which is a particular way that fund managers and sellers of financial products can sell their services and their products in the European Union. What's never mentioned is that passporting didn't exist before 2007. People just used offices in the jurisdictions they were selling in, and already most of the fund management industry is doing this. Look, the City of London, I mean, on most measures, London is either the centre of global finance or number two to a place called New York. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. So the City of London will look after itself. And any notion that the EU is going to cut off the City of London is just complete nonsense. When the German government wants to sell bonds, it sells them in the City of London. When French companies want to sell corporate bonds, they sell them in the City of London. Because if they don't sell them in the City of London, it costs them money, because the City of London has the deepest and the widest and the most efficient and the most globally plugged in capital markets. So the City of London is very, very good at lobbying. But in the end, I think whatever happens in this Brexit deal or even a non-deal, the City of London will do just fine. Fishing is completely at the other end of the spectrum. Whether or not there's a fishing deal will seriously impact the lives and livelihoods of some of our most marginal and poorest communities. You know, you've been in politics a long time, Daisy. You know this. The poorest parts of the UK aren't actually the inner cities, which get most of the press. The poorest parts of the UK are those communities just inland from what used to be really thriving fishing communities. So if you can get those fishing communities back up and running, tourism comes alongside, you get more and more people living there as people are working from home more and broadband links come, and that economic upside from a reasonable fishing deal will ripple inland, pardon the watery pun, to those very marginal communities. And it's not just the fact that we're dealing with some of the most marginal people here. We're also dealing with some of the most economically, politically sensitive parts of the UK as well. I've mentioned, because it hasn't been in the press much, but it's very much on the mind of our politicians, the importance of fishing for keeping the union together, for those fishing villages, particularly up the east coast of Scotland, which have been decimated since the early 70s, since Britain joined the European Economic Community, as was. But you'll know well from your political background, down in the West Country as well, Cornwall and Devon, the sort of bit of England that's that goes off to the left and points to the southwest. There are lots of marginal community constituencies there. They're typically fought over between the Conservatives on the one hand and the Lib Dems, our third party, on the other. And unlike in US politics, our third party is a very significant force. It was in coalition between 2010 and 2015. So, yes, of course, the City of London speaks loudly and it has lots of friends in the press. And yes, of course, the car makers employ lots of people and they also have lots of friends in the press. The press tends to deride the fishing communities, but politicians know how politically potent those fishing communities can be. And it's no surprise at all. I wrote a book on Brexit 3 years ago, predicted it will come down to fishing. And it seems bad for a lot of metropolitan people, but politically, it's completely predictable.
And it's the same for Emmanuel Macron. He has the same issue with French fishermen, that it's a slightly bigger portion of their economy, I think, but it's as potent politically, and that's why he's digging his heels in. Just in case you're wrong and there isn't a last-minute deal, and we do crash out, which many people in the city are obviously preparing themselves for, in that effect, what do you think the effect would be? And particularly, what do you think the monetary policy-making effect would be?
Well, I would contest a lot of the vocabulary. If we go and trade on World Trade Organization rules, it's often been portrayed as a disaster, particularly by people who never wanted Brexit to happen and were trying to reverse Brexit. But of course, the UK trades with the US on WTO rules. That's our biggest single country trading partner. It's about a fifth of our exports and trade overall. The US trades with the EU on WTO rules, hundreds of billions of dollars of trade. So I think the actual, destination of WTO rules is absolutely fine. There are some big export sectors which will be subject to tariffs, like cars, depending on the proportion of the car that's actually made in the UK, and some meat and dairy products. But, the UK earns tremendous export revenue from the EU because we run a big trade deficit with the EU. So a lot of that money can be used to subsidize the particular sectors that suffer. But, let's be completely clear. I'm not undermining the argument that if it is no deal, particularly because there's quite a widespread expectation at the moment that beyond all the usual shadow boxing and posturing, there probably will be a deal. If there isn't a deal, then in the first few weeks it will be a shock, just because businesses have been told now 3 times to prepare for no deal, given how protracted this process has been. And there will be many who are so busy, I think, they'll do a deal. I don't believe the fact that there'll be no deal. I mean, many business leaders will think that, particularly the small and medium-sized enterprises that are suffering most from COVID, that employ most of our people. And also the currency markets, particularly dollar sterling, cable, as we say in the currency markets, has become a kind of barometer of whether or not the UK is going to get a deal. It's nothing to do with the growth rate of the US or the trade of the UK. It's like a political litmus test, isn't it? And any time that there's a statement from Michael Gove, basically our deputy prime minister, if you like, or Boris Johnson or Michel Barnier, the EU's chief negotiator, that suggests the deal is more or less likely, then sterling literally goes up or down. So if there isn't a deal, then sterling will come off slightly. But, in a world where everybody's struggling to get their exports out the door anyway, in a world where countries everywhere are looking for competitive advantage, Downing Street won't mind if sterling comes down a bit. I mean, they'll think of it as a badge of honour. So I think this will go to the wire, and I think between now and whenever there finally is a deal, and I imagine it will be in December, then sterling will bounce around contingent on where the political rhetoric currently is.
And what about Andrew Bailey at the Bank of England has been talking to banks about possibly going into negative interest rates. Obviously, the idea behind that being that people will stop sitting on their money and they'll start investing, and that will help if there is a big shock. Denmark has done it. As I said, he's asking banks to tell him whether they could manage it or not. Yeah. Is that an answer to a possible shock?
No, I mean, I don't think negative interest rates are a good idea for the reasons I'll explain, but that doesn't mean that they won't happen. As you rightly say, we've seen an enormous stimulus from central banks around the world and governments around the world in response to COVID. I did some sums last week before writing my Sunday Telegraph column, which I do every week, called Economic Agenda. And I worked out that since COVID, central banks, in terms of their balance sheet expansion, basically quantitative easing, and governments around the world had launched a stimulus that was equal to 20% of last year's global GDP. I mean, these are absolutely massive sums. And that's, of course, on top of all the massive stimulus we've seen since the global financial crisis in 2008-9. Between 2008-9 and 2019, central banks around the world expanded their balance sheets 2 or 3-fold, even more in some cases, but that's the main ones: the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of England, Bank of Japan, and so on. And now we've seen another 50% expansion since then. So you've got huge policy stimulus going on. Most of the political class seems to be using phrases like, it's different this time, we can keep spending. It seems we have to learn the same lessons in every single generation, doesn't it? And now we've got the governor of the Bank of England, who, is a serious guy, a very highly qualified economist, and believe it or not, was chosen after Mark Carney as the sort of small c conservative candidate. Now he's talking about negative interest rates. Of course, we've had negative real interest rates for a long time because the interest rate is lower than the rate of inflation, but we're talking about negative nominal interest rates going through the looking glass. As you've said, Denmark's done that, the ECB's done that since since 5 years now, almost 6 years. Sweden did negative nominal interest rates, though they've since reversed it. My take is this: financial markets are pretty overvalued. The idea that the S&P and 500 is an all-time high, even though we're in the middle of the biggest economic collapse in 100 years, just doesn't compute with me. It's largely because of central bank stimulus and people not wanting to get left behind. And of course, financial markets are always going to want more. They're always going to want lower interest rates. They're always going to want more QE, and now negative interest rates. The theory of negative interest rates, it's fine, because it means that commercial banks are charged to put money on deposit at the central bank, which means, as the audience well knows, we're talking to a sophisticated audience here, that the incentive should be then for those commercial banks, instead of putting money at the central bank, as long as they got enough reserve asset ratio, they should be getting that money out the door and lending it. But in the end, it doesn't happen like that, because commercial banks, high street banks, they're not going to pass those negative rates on to customers because they're worried about a run on deposits. They're worried about people going to cash. They're worried about being found out. So their margins get squeezed. The banks actually end up with a weaker balance sheet, which means they lend less. And this is where economic theory breaks down and practical reality imposes itself on the world. That is what's happened in Sweden. That's why Sweden have gone off negative nominal interest rates. That's what's happening in the ECB. But the ECB needs as much central bank stimulus as it can to keep the single currency together. That's why the Fed isn't doing negative nominal interest rates, because it knows this is what happens. And then negative rates can also push lots of mainstream commercial money into high yielding assets, because pension funds, insurance companies, they can't, bonds go even more negative. It's very hard for them to get anything where they can get a proper return to match their long-term liabilities. And I think in the end, if we keep doing negative interest rates around the world, if we keep, basically depreciating our currencies deliberately, it is going to lead to international conflict. This is what history shows. This is what happened in the 1930s. We're not there yet. I'm not saying we'll get there, but there's certainly a lot more protectionism, and a mainstream authoritative country like the UK doing negative nominal interest rates is basically, it's going to light the touch paper on the whole world doing negative interest rates, and it's not going to end well.
Interesting you mentioned protectionism there, and obviously Brexit is happening. We're not quite sure how, we're not exactly sure under what circumstances. We do know when, pretty much. Do you think that
For now. What's his
For
face,
now.
Daisy?
Yeah, exactly. It's early
It's
days.
2020, remember?
Well, anything can happen. Do you think that when we leave, that will lead to more European protectionism, and what that impact might be on markets specifically?
Well, I certainly hope not. I mean, a lot of people, when they voted stay in the European Economic Community, as it was in the UK in 1975, we had already joined without a referendum, but there was a referendum 2 years afterwards for interesting political reasons, which we can discuss, but it's probably a bit too much for this audience. But a lot of people wanted to join the European Economic Community because they like the idea of free trade. They like the idea of a trading bloc. And I like the idea of a trading bloc. And I was a big supporter of Britain staying in the European Union. Where a lot of people fell out of love with the European Union was, since various treaty changes in 2009, 2011, and also in the early 90s, if we're honest, it started to take on the form of a country in its own right. With it went way beyond trading and freedom of movement, people, and so on. And it became too much for a lot of countries, the Brits in particular. But there is a post-war history of free trade in the European Union. And I'm hoping that between us we can hang on to that. I'm hoping that when the dust has settled, and the figures that we've come to know, and I say know and love, but I'm not sure that's quite the right verb. The negotiators, the politicians of our day, who have staked their reputation on being tough and giving no quarter in this negotiation. And any business negotiation is difficult when it's in the full glare of publicity and there's lots of political spin. Of course, it's going to be tough. But I'm hoping that once the dust has settled, once the UK has left, even if we leave without a deal, and once everybody realizes that Brexit isn't the end of the world, we can still be a very plausible and vibrant economy in the UK, and I passionately believe that we can be, then I'm hoping that wiser heads will prevail, because it really does make sense for everybody, for the United Kingdom and the European Union, to have a free trade deal. It would be pretty mad for us to have a free trade deal with the Canadians and the New Zealanders and not have one with our biggest trading partner. Now,
and of course, we do now have a deal with Japan as of just a few days ago. We know that negotiations are ongoing. The fifth round is about to start with the American negotiators. Of course, we haven't even mentioned the American election yet, which under normal circumstances would be probably all we were talking
the elephant
about.
in the room is breathing on me over my shoulder.
Yeah, I don't know whether that's Biden or Trump or a mixture of the two. But of course, that does have an impact. Whoever wins that election does have an impact on the UK economy. It has an impact on those negotiations. We're led to believe. We're told that a deal with Trump's administration, an FTA deal, would be easier than with Joe Biden's administration. A lot has been said about the fact that he's concerned about the Good Friday Agreement, whether or not that's because he's talking to American voters who are concerned about matters to do with Ireland. You would know better than me. But first of all, I'm going to ask you the question that everyone's saying: who's going to win the American election? And secondary, what difference does it make to our economy and to our future trade deal?
Well, I think Trump's got a lot more chance than most mainstream commentators say, because I think it's just as a neutral observer. I think most mainstream commentators probably want Biden to win, because that's just how the media is. And I think there's something going on in America, talking to my American family, as I do quite a lot, which we will remember, Daisy, from our early days observing politics in '92, called the spiral of silence. The spiral of silence is when you had lots of people who, after years of Thatcher in the '80s, who was pretty hard-nosed and lots of liberalisation and lots of traditional industries falling by the wayside, a lot of people said they didn't want the Conservatives anymore and would tell pollsters they didn't want the Conservatives anymore, but in the privacy of the polling booth, they voted Conservative. And a pretty good Labour politician, actually, I've got a lot of respect for, Neil Kinnock, he did a kind of Dewey versus Truman in 48. He did the English version in 92. He basically gave a victory speech at the Sheffield rally. We've all seen the footage if you're political nerds in the UK like Daisy and I. And he lost because of the spiral of silence. I think there's a bit of a spiral of silence going on in the US. It's difficult to know because of the Electoral College, of course. And also, I think we're all underestimating the extent of the potential for at least protests about postal voting fraud. I mean, I love America. I've spent a lot of my life in America. I'm a huge friend and ally of America. And my heart would break if America got into a situation where it was a contested election and then the amount of fraud that was being posited was bigger than the margin of victory. I mean, that would really rock the world, and not in a good way. So I'm hoping whatever is the outcome of the US election, it's a clear outcome. But I'm not banking on that for 1 minute, and I'm sure you're not either, Daisy. In terms of the Brexit deal, it really is important we get a Brexit deal, a trade deal with the European Union in the end. 20 years ago, about 60% of the UK's trade was with the European Union. It's now about 40 to 45%, depending on your definition. But it's still important. When we joined the European Union, it was 40% of the world economy, and it was 6 countries. Now it's 27 countries, and it's 18% of the world economy, 15 when we've left. So it's a lot less important than it was, and we are a service sector superpower. And services, there is no distance because we're basically squirting our exports down fiber optic cables and through Zoom calls and all the rest of it. So distance isn't as important as has been made out in the mainstream commentators. But of course, the optics matter. And clearly, even dyed-in-the-wool Labour Party supporters here in the UK who would prefer Biden to win under most circumstances, they're pretty much aligned with the Democrats. They would say that a free trade agreement with America is much more likely if it's Trump-Johnson rather than Biden-Johnson. If only because of the personal chemistry between the two men and the fact that they've been talking about it for a long time. And then, as you rightly alluded to, Daisy, there is this extra complication. An enormous amount has been made of the technical issues to be resolved on the border, the island of Ireland. Now, this is incredibly arcane, unless you are a Brit or an Irish person, or like me, both. But basically, you have a land border across Ireland, and one side of it will end up being outside the European Union, and one side will end up being inside the European Union. At the moment, both sides are inside the European Union, but not after the 31st of December. That border is incredibly politically sensitive. In my and Daisy's lifetime, it was, armed towers, guys in khaki and camouflage, tanks, literally armoured personnel carriers on that border. And I crossed it a lot as a child, and it wasn't particularly nice. You have rural communities. You literally have this border going through individual farms and living rooms in some cases because of the historic alignment of these two countries. And if that border was reimposed in a way that was lacking in sensitivity and that was visible, you would have serious flare-ups, irredentist flare-ups among extremists on both the Catholic side and the Protestant side in Ireland, along that border country. Of that, I have no doubt. But on the other hand, the border's been invisible since the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, which Daisy referred to. It's already a currency border, it's already a tax border, it's already a duty border, it's already a border for all kinds of legal and sanitary reasons. A lot of farm exports go one side to the other, of course. And I've read and written about many technical papers, some of them even commissioned by the European Parliament, that said you can continue to have an invisible border. But it has suited a lot of opponents of Brexit, both here in the UK and in Ireland, to say that that's impossible. I think that in the end, common sense will prevail. I think in the end, there will still be an invisible border. There'll be checks at individual companies. There'll be so-called authorized economic operators. But all that is a leap of faith. and both sides now have every incentive to make it sound more difficult than it actually is. So if Biden does win, then obviously he feels that there's an Irish American vote up for grabs, and he can make hay by being seen to support Dublin rather than to support London. I would not to tell the potential president of the United States his business, but I think that's far too simplistic a reading of the Irish American vote. The Irish American vote is no longer a kind of captured Democrat body that they can just call on. The Irish American vote is completely varied, and I have no evidence for this, but I'd put money on the fact that most people of Irish American origin will be voting for Trump rather than Biden.
Interesting. And if we come down to the specifics of that trade deal, we keep being told they want access to our healthcare market, to the NHS. They want to, flood our market with hormone-injected beef and with chlorinated chicken and all the rest of it, which runs against our standards. We want access to Wall Street. We want people movement, which is obviously not specifically in the deal, but it's hard to see how these specifics, which again are very totemic and they're very good headline grabbing issues, how they're going to be resolved.
It is, but it may be that we don't need to resolve them, Daisy, because it may be that we go on as we are. And as I said in my opening remarks, the US and the we already do 19% of our trade with the US. It's already our single biggest country trading partner. There's nothing to stop us trading with the US. Again, I like trade agreements. I wrote a book 3 years ago about the sort of trade agreements the UK could forge outside of the European Union, which it currently can't forge because it's part of something called the Customs Union, which means you can't negotiate your own trade deals. But in the end, trade deals are just an added bonus. Using the World Trade Organization rules, which are effective for the most part, you can do an awful lot of trade. The two biggest economies in the world trade under WTO rules, right? In fact, the three biggest economies in the world, if you count the EU as, one of the top three economies along with the Chinese and the US, they haven't got a trade deal between them. Not one side of that triangle is a trade deal. It's all under WTO rules, and it's getting on for half of all trade on the planet, right? We already trade as the UK outside the EU is already the majority of our trade. We're the only big country in the EU where that is the case, and most of that non-EU trade is already under WTO rules. So I desperately hope we will do a trade deal with the US, but it's wrong to say, as I keep hearing on endless TV, radio broadcasts in this country, that unless we get a trade deal, then we can't trade. Utter nonsense.
So would you be a proponent of those that have started to reuse Theresa May's old expression of saying, no trade deal is better than a bad trade deal? And one of the things, I was interviewing Peter Mandelson last week, and he pointed out, which I think is a very good point, trade deals are created by politicians, but they're used by businesses. And you were saying in your opening remarks, you and I have been interviewing politicians for long enough to know some of them get it and some of them really don't.
I should be clear. So Peter Mandelson is a very talented Labour cabinet minister. Peter Mandelson, for non-Brits watching this, Peter Mandelson's a big reason that Tony Blair became Prime Minister. I just think that's historically accurate. And he was a very, very good cabinet minister under Labour, and he was also a very shrewd EU trade commissioner. And he understands, but he also understands that in the end, if you don't have a trade deal, that's absolutely fine as well. I desperately want the US and the UK to have a trade deal because I think there'll be more trade anyway when we're focused more on the rest of the world, when we're focused more on what will be the 85% of the economy outside the European Union, rather than the 15 or 16% inside, that's growing a lot faster than the European Union. And if we do manage to overcome these issues that you've outlined, Daisy, then we can do a trade deal with the US. God knows they certainly want to do a trade deal with us because we are a good way to, if they do a trade deal with us, they can then leverage any trade deal that we do with the European Union, and we can become like a sort of clearinghouse for goods from around the world into the European Union, providing we do that EU trade deal. That's one reason why some people in the European Union are so nervous of us doing a trade deal with them, not just for trade as it currently stands, but given what the UK could become. And there are cultural issues to overcome. You know, I've eaten plenty of chlorinated chicken. It's fine. I think it would be fine to sell it in the UK as long as it was labelled properly. I mean, there's chlorine all over the bags of salad you buy at Marks and Spencer's. Other salad is available. But I do understand there are concerns from some people, and that's completely fine. And there are certainly concerns about the negotiating power of big US institutions who want access to some action in the British public sector. And of course, there are vested interests here in the UK that want to protect their patch. All that is up for grabs. I think a UK-US trade deal will take quite a lot of time. Even if Trump gets re-elected, it may not even happen in a second Trump administration, and not just because of COVID, because it will take a long time. Because unlike what the trade deal we're trying to do with the EU, this is the only trade deal in the history where we're trying to do a deal to keep things roughly as they are, rather than do a trade deal that changes lots of things. For the US and the UK to do a trade deal, given that we've been in the European Union and its predecessors since 1973, there is a lot to negotiate. And I would be very cautious if I was a cabinet minister of, hanging my reputation on getting a trade deal with the United States anytime soon. I think it will happen, but it's much more complicated than is being made out.
This is the other issue, and I know we've run out of time, so I'll have to make this very quick last question to you, but just a thought on that. Now, I spent quite a lot of last week with some of the negotiators who are working at the Department for International Trade, being headed up by the Permanent Secretary, Antonia Romeo, and they're an impressive, very impressive lady. Very impressive bunch of negotiators. But if you then bear in mind, these are people having to learn brand new skills, because we haven't had to do trade deals. We don't have those people just sitting on the shelf. America has done bilaterals, multilateral trade deals, practically coming out of its ears for the last few years. So they do have an advantage over us in that they've done more trade deals recently and they kind of know what they're doing.
Yes and no. I think the UK's got some very talented civil servants working on Brexit at the moment. You mentioned our Permanent Secretary there. I think David Frost is also a very talented and capable man. He's our chief negotiator, if you like. But, I think I've been to pretty much every WTO summit since the Seattle riots of 1999, which some older viewers will remember. Doha in 2001 when the Chinese joined, Cancun in 2004, more riots, but lots of negotiating going on. And what struck me during those negotiations, when the WTO contacted me and I talked to them and I got down to it with various diplomats talking about what was actually going on. There's a lot of Brits floating around, a lot of Brits on both sides of any negotiation. We haven't specifically negotiated our own trade deals, but even within the European Union, when they've been negotiating trade deals, it's often been Brits at the fore. Because if you're the European Union, you want to talk to the Americans, you want to talk to the Indians, you want to talk to the Aussies, you want to talk to the Kiwis, you want to talk to the Canadians, and even the Japanese. What country is sort of well placed to do that? It's generally been the Brits and the Irish who have led the charge in terms of trade negotiation within the EU. So no, we haven't had specifically our own department for negotiating trade deals, but I don't think we're underpowered in that area at all. I think the reason trade deals might be slower than we thought is just because they're actually quite complicated. And when it comes down to it, WTO rules, even though it's been presented as some kind of disaster, is not all that bad. And in many cases, it's actually pretty good. As I say, the majority of the UK's trade now is outside the EU, and the majority of that is under WTO rules.
So, Liam, you're basically a Brexit optimist. I think it's fair to say. Going to bring it back to high yield bonds. Where do you see your prediction of how global economy is going to go, how European trade deals are going, how Brexit's going? Where does that leave our audience?
Well, I'm optimistic, Daisy, in the sense that I think once we've done Brexit, there are quite a lot of advantages for the UK. Free ports, our own regional policy, ability to strike trade deals around the world. ability to sort of spend a lot more of our diplomatic and political time, effort, energy, and bandwidth on, the markets that we actually trade most with. So in that sense, I guess I'm an optimist. But it will be bumpy. The politicians will make sure it's bumpy between then and now. So there's going to be a lot of bad headlines out the UK, because there's still a lot of people in our political and media class that really don't want this to happen and detest the fact it is happening, and detest the Prime Minister, by the way. That's just a sort of political fact of life. So I think sterling's going to get a lot weaker before it gets stronger, if that's interesting for anybody listening. But I think as and when, even without a deal, we leave in early January, once, chicken licking, the sky doesn't fall on our head, or chicken little, as he's called in America, then I think sterling will surge, because it just will have been oversold due to Brexit, doom mongering, if you like. More generally, I think the future of the world economy, it's really in our hands. It depends on the COVID narrative. The UK was really growing strongly in June, July, and August as we came out of most of our lockdown. But now we've got into a situation which a lot of the Western world has got into, where while cases are going up as testing's going up, cases are up threefold in the UK compared to April, but testing is up 11-fold. So in terms of tests conducted, cases are actually down. But that apparently is too difficult a concept for the general public, at least the politicians think that. So we're locking down again, and I think we'll lock down for most of the winter, and I think other countries are going to follow. I personally think it's a much broader discussion. A lot of that is a self-inflicted wound, but it is an economic and political reality now. I think the really big, interesting trend in the global economy at the moment, which we're hardly noticing because rightly we're all obsessed with COVID and the impact of COVID on our own economies, our own personal finances, and our own home financial markets. China's going to grow this year by about 2%. It's going to grow next year by about 7%. So, and the UK is going to contract this year by about 9%, and even the States is going to contract by about 5 or 6%. So we've seen over the last 20, 30 years since the Berlin Wall fell, a big shift in economic centre of gravity from west to east. It's taking a long time, but that is the economic megatrend of our time, and it's a trend that's being accelerated and accentuated by COVID.
Well, we started with some optimism, and maybe tinged the end there with a bit of pessimism or a bit of reality. We probably could chat for another couple of hours, but we haven't got another couple of hours. Liam, thank you so very much, and I hope to continue this another time. Liam Halligan there, thank you. And
thank you for having me, and have a good rest of the conference.